What's up, everybody? Wanted to make a video about a completely non-controversial subject, which it's a good time to do it now that there's a war breaking out in Israel, Palestine. I actually had wanted to do it before, but it's kind of such a can of worms. I just never was in the mood or had the right frame of mind to do it, but that's an important subject, I feel like the Israel-Palestine conflict is probably the most complex geopolitical situation in the world, combined with it being the worst understood and the most lied about. So that kind of adds up. And that's really saying something, because there's a lot of crazy conflict regions in the world, like the Koreas, like, Taiwan, some of the situations in Europe, especially historically, with the Germans in the outbreak of World War One or World War Two. Well, I mean, all of the above, really. But I've read a lot about it. I took some classes on it, so I definitely don't fancy myself an expert. But since everyone has an opinion, I think people get bogged down in the details so that they're analyzing not the core of the issue, but really the symptoms of the underlying problem. And just to state that bluntly, I think that is the Palestine-Israel conflict. The reason why there's no end in sight, why peace isn't a real option, is because the Palestinian side refuses to recognize a Jewish sovereign state of any size. So it's like, I think even if Tel Aviv proper, this would never happen, but if Israel said, okay, we just want Jewish sovereignty in Tel Aviv proper, which is extremely small, that it wouldn't be accepted by the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian representatives. Maybe they would accept it now, but historically, they basically wouldn't accept a state of any size. And that's really the nature of the conflict. So, and now it's gotten to the point where Israel almost, because this conflict has gone on so long, won't recognize a Palestinian state of any size. Now that I come to think of it, that's not quite true, but it would at least be a real hard pill to swallow. So you have two states, and neither will recognize the other one. So that basically that's what it boils down to. Now that's a simplification, but we have all these border proposals on this map right here. This map isn't really accurate, by the way. It's not accurate, but it gets people animated, and it's interesting to look at. Because basically the green shows, it's not really showing Palestinian ruled or Palestinian settled land. It's basically showing all the land that the Jews didn't have control or sovereignty over. So, the whole southern half of Israel, hardly anybody lives there. It's all desert. So, as far as it showing it solid green, that's not very accurate. It would be, more the northern half, and Israel settling the Yeshiv, which is the original Jewish settlements in the 1946 map, showing up in blue. So along the coast, and then into I can't remember this area of the country, what it's called now, into the Galilee, where they settled and grew crops and things of that nature. So they had multiple partition proposals. The Peel Commission, I think that was in the 20s. The Arabs refused to, and I gotta say, if I was Palestinian, maybe I would feel this way. They felt like the full geography of Palestine should be under control of the Palestinian Arabs. because they were the dominant population. I mean, they didn't physically live on every stretch of the land. Like I said, half of it was desert, if not more. There were other smaller minority groups, but they were the dominant group. So I can understand why they expected to have sovereignty, or at least be the ruling majority over the whole landmass. But I also understand why I would say it's totally understandable that Jews wanted to have sovereignty, at least in the areas they settled. Now, what makes that difficult? Well, you can see how small this landmass is and how vulnerable it would be to invasion. So even if the Arabs did agree to a small area, it was ripe for invasion and destruction. And being that the Arabs weren't willing to negotiate whatsoever on a Jewish sovereign state of any size, basically, there wasn't even a possibility. And the Palestinians were definitely concerned about Jewish expansion. So Israel today would be concerned about Palestinian expansion from the West Bank. They were concerned about Jewish expansionism. So distrust on both sides, which after 100 years of war is higher maybe than it's ever been, almost. That's why this conflict persists. So to me, it doesn't matter. The borders don't matter. I mean, they matter, but it's not at the core of the issue. All the other variables are not at the core of the issue. It can be explained by, will the Palestinian Arabs, will they recognize a Jewish sovereign state? And will Israel recognize a Palestinian sovereign state? And at this point, both sides are saying no, and they don't want to integrate. So the war is going to last until both sides recognize each other, or they agree to a combined binational state. And I can't foresee that ever happening. Or one side completely overwhelms the other militarily, which is basically what has happened with Israel. And so the Palestinians live under occupation. But I made this video because people are just so naive on the subject. And I'm not trying to say I'm some type of expert, but look, like everybody learns about a subject and they want to share their take because they think they're right. Well, I mean, I think I'm right. I remember taking this Middle Eastern class and people had all these proposals, partition plans like you see on the map here. Oh, the West Bank will go to the Palestinians, and we'll do the 67 borders, and then we'll have an open city Jerusalem. But that shit is never going to work with the underlying unsolved issues that I've mentioned. So it's just impossible. And then, people want to influence it. The United States has been the most involved of any country, but also the European powers and maybe other Arab countries. Honestly, I think overall it probably has done more harm than good. Just let them deal with each other, let them fight it out. Let them mutually reach out for arbitration or something like that. But these wars are just going to keep going until one of the conditions that I've mentioned happens. Israel totally overwhelms the Palestinians, which they basically have done, but the Palestinians still obviously resist, and Israel's not going to be so ham-fisted they just go and smash Gaza completely, which they would suffer repercussions from that. But it's basically going to be them living under occupation. People always say apartheid, right, to paint it in a negative light, and it's definitely not a positive situation, but I think that's applying a description that was a different country and trying to apply it to Israel to portray it in a negative light. I just think it's stupid. It doesn't really add context and really obfuscates the truth. It's accurate to say the Palestinians live under occupation, and that's the only option right now. Israel doesn't want to pull out and let the Palestinians have full sovereignty because they feel the West Bank is going to be turned into a terrorist haven like Gaza. And they're probably right about that. There's I don't know, a small chance if they pulled out and created an independent state, maybe there could be a chance at some type of long-term peace, but history has proven that not to be the case, and Israel doesn't want to pay with blood, you know. People watching this who don't live in Israel, it wouldn't be your blood, it would be their blood, like happened in 2000. Not 2000. It was before then, when whether it was Camp David or the Oslo Peace Accords, and then that was the start of the Second Intifada. People on both sides, factions on both sides, didn't want peace. So what do the Palestinians want? I mean, really, in their hearts, I feel like they want one combined Palestinian state. How they would treat Jews and other minority groups in that state, well, that's really uncertain, but probably would not go well for the Jews, especially after all this war. So that's why pretty much all Israelis are against that. I used to think the establishment of the state of Israel was not even talking about morally, but it was a stupid decision. I mean, all these problems you now see were definitely foreseeable. Jabotinsky talked about them. Will the Arabs resist? Yes, of course they'll resist, but once we build walls tall enough and strong enough, after paraphrasing a famous quote of his, after running up against that wall and not being able to break it, then we'll have peace, or something along these lines. But on paper and in theory is a lot different from the reality. So the history has been incredibly bloody and difficult. I guess my thought process is why establish a state that's going to be a constant war when I don't know, New York Jews can just move to New York or London and live in the diaspora in peace. I feel differently now. I feel like that is kind of a naive way to think, because that wasn't an option for many Jews. They didn't just have a free pass to go to London or New York or Argentina or some other safe haven, especially pre-World War II, when the whole world basically froze out Jews and others that were looking for a safe haven. And that would require trusting the majority population in these places. So especially after World War II, which is when, I mean, the idea of Israel definitely preceded World War II and the Holocaust. Israel probably still would have been established without the Holocaust, but World War II and the Holocaust really gave it steam, because you had a pretty large number of determined refugees that wanted to make it happen right then and there. They didn't want to go back to Poland. They didn't want to go back to Germany or France after being betrayed by other governments and their neighbors, etc. So they had the determination and the catalyst to make it happen. So a lot of people say Israel only exists because of the Holocaust, is Holocaust reparations. I definitely think that's not true. You could even make the case that Israel would be stronger without the Holocaust, because you would have so many more people, even without the Holocaust, that lived such a horrible existence in Poland and, I don't know, Romania, Bulgaria, Belarus, Russia. In Russia alone, in the Soviet Union alone, you would have had more potential refugees than like all of the ones that survived the Holocaust. So I definitely think it probably would have happened without the Holocaust. It would have just been different. I think that's stupid. It's just a canard that people say, oh, Israel was just created for the Holocaust by people that are just, reciting a meme or something like this. So I think Israel was a necessary creation for a people that came upon really desperate times at its creation, and established something that was a safe haven for Jews in the future that faced incredible adversity to the point where they would want to leave their countries. So definitely an imperfect execution and an idea that runs up against a lot of harsh realities that almost make it non-feasible, but they really forged their will and created what isn't imperfect but a pretty amazing country, land, and place out of a really crude piece of iron infused with a lot of carbon that had to be pounded out. Okay, that was a really crude analogy I just made, but the best I could do on the spot. But this is the way I look at the conflict, which is realist in nature, but I think helps get a better handle of the situation. I mean, Israel's not going anywhere. They're a nuclear power. They're the dominant military region. They've been recognized by a lot of Arab governments now that have really moved on from the conflict and the Palestinians, because they feel the Palestinians are just too unreasonable, or they see more benefit to befriending Israel and moving on from the conflict than sticking it out with the Palestinians that are probably may never agree to a peace deal, or not in sight anyway. And I think the conflict is just going to go on as it has, and it's going to take a visionary Arab leader to put his life on the line and put everything on the line to say, we're going to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, as a Jewish sovereign state, which has never happened. They recognize Israel, but still demand that, all the Palestinian refugees return, which is, by some numbers, like 5 million people, 4 or 5 million people, which would totally wreck the demographics of Israel being a Jewish state, which is really the mission of having all those refugees return. So that's just a non-starter. But I think it's just going to continue, and the Palestinians are going to be under occupation until that happens, because I don't see the Palestinians can't defeat Israel. Israel's not going to agree to a binational state. Israel is not going to completely ethnically cleanse or expel all the Palestinians. That's exceedingly unlikely. So the most likely option is continued occupation until you work out some type of a deal where the Palestinians can have a limited but some type of sovereignty. I'm just trying to think if there's any other issues I haven't touched upon. I mean, look at the most bitter wars were fought with Egypt, and that seemed like it would never end. And the geography is a little bit more straightforward there, but they've had a peace with Egypt for 30, 40 years at this point. That could happen with some of the other neighbors. These Arab governments are unstable, so they can be toppled. They can get worse, but they could potentially get better. So the future is unpredictable in that respect, but basically neither side can get everything they want unless they were to ethnically cleanse the other. No, I'm not promoting that. I'm saying I don't want that, but I do want there to be a peace where both sides can sacrifice and get the gist of what they want. That's not really going to happen for the Palestinians, but they're going to have to make some sacrifices. They're going to be living under occupation. There's a lot of talk in dissident right circles about how Israel is the dog that wags the tail, or I forget that expression. You know, Israel dominates American politics, and some people say it's the other way around. I think Israel has a lot of influence because Americans let Israel have a lot of influence. Because they see in Israel something they admire, which is a determination for independence, a Western-style sovereign democracy that doesn't exist in any other country in the Middle East, pretty much. And every other country is unstable and ruled by a tyrant in that region. And Israel is the one country that is a stable democracy, so that largely explains the situation, as well as admiring the fortitude of the Jews there. What else? And having the relationship we do with Israel prevents any other power from dominating that region. At the moment, Iran, but also maybe in the past, Nasser in Egypt, the Soviet-backed powers. Yeah, they were our Cold War ally. That's what I wanted to say. And really, anyone that wants to have a relationship with the United States, or everyone has to go through the United States if they want to have, peace with Israel or a good relationship with Israel. And so it solidifies our influence over there. I think that explains a lot of it. I think people that say, the U.S. fights wars because of Israel, there's spurgs. I think we fight wars because we want to fight wars. We want to be involved in the region, or at least our leaders do, or George Bush. I don't think the U.S. is willingly sacrificing its own blood for the sake of Israel. But yeah, these are largely my views that I wanted to get out there on an interesting subject. Think about, we went to bat for Kuwait, of all countries, in the first Iraq War, and they bombarded Israel with Scuds trying to pull Israel into the war after the fact. But we defended Israel. We defended Kuwait, I'm sorry. We never went into Israel proper to defend them from an invasion. We helped them in 73, but we didn't have any boots on the ground. So people spurg out, and there's so much lies and inaccuracies about the situation over there. I think it benefits just to have a realistic, healthy view of what's going on, which I believe I do, but I'm sure people will disagree, which they're welcome to vocalize. Anyway, anyone have a comment, feel free to leave it. Everyone have a good day.